Our gospel lesson this morning is taken from the book of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. And if you're able, I invite you to please stand for the reading of our gospel lesson this morning. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" The king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those on his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. The gospel of the Lord. Praise be to you, Lord Christ. You may have a seat. Well, there are many jokes about people arriving at the pearly gates and being met by St. Peter, who asks them a series of questions to determine whether or not they are fit to enter into heaven. One such story is of a woman who had a nightmare, that she arrived at the pearly gates only to see the person in front of her being turned away. As the person walked in her direction, she noticed that it was Mother Teresa. Shocked and surprised to see that Mother Teresa had been turned away at the pearly gates, she asked, "What happened?" Mother Teresa wore a forlorn expression on her face as she replied, "They told me that I should have done more good works." Now, we know that none of us will get into heaven based upon the number of good works that we've done, or whether or not our good works outweigh our bad works. Even though at first glance, Jesus' parable here in Matthew 25, 31 to 46 might seem to suggest that that is the case. In this parable, Jesus comes in glory and is seated on his throne. All of the nations of the world are gathered together before him. And Jesus separates the people, putting some on his left side, the bad side, and some on his right side, the good side, based upon whether or not they fed Jesus when he was hungry, or welcomed him when he was a stranger, or took care of him when he was sick, or visited him when he was in prison. Now, neither of the groups seems to recall having fed, clothed, visited, or welcomed Jesus. But Jesus tells them, "Just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." The ones on his right, the sheep, who fed, clothed, visited, and welcomed the least of these, are told that they will inherit the kingdom prepared for them from the foundation of the world. Whereas those on his left, the goats, who did not feed or clothe or welcome the least of these are sent away into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Now, to some of us, this parable might feel like a rather nightmarish story, like the one that I shared at the beginning of this sermon, especially when we compare ourselves with people that we might consider saintly, like Mother Teresa. We might wonder, how do we know if we've properly fed, clothed, or welcomed the members of Christ's family? How do we know if we've properly taken care of the least of these? How do we know if we would be among the sheep or the goats in Jesus' parable? Now, like the previous parables that we saw over the past few weeks in Matthew 25, this parable also is intended to provide a picture of how we are to live in the here and now, as we await that future time when Christ returns in his glory and brings God's reign in its fullness. And rather than a point-by-point allegory where every single detail of the story corresponds necessarily to something in our day and age, Jesus' story was most likely intended to evoke a feeling, emotion, or action, and to make a few simple key points. One of the main points that we take away from this parable is that we serve Jesus when we serve others, particularly when we serve those who are in need, who Jesus calls the least of these, and those who are the members of Christ's family. You see, when Jesus ascended into heaven, he knew, I believe, that his followers would be tempted to fight amongst themselves, like the mean sheep that we saw in our Old Testament lesson in Ezekiel 34:21, who pushed the other animals out of the way, and they pushed the weaker animals in particular out of the way so that the stronger ones could have all the food for themselves. And in that same way, Jesus' followers would be tempted to lust after power, to try to fill the leadership vacuum that would be left because Jesus was no longer living among them. But Jesus wanted his disciples back then, and us today as his followers, to know that he is indeed among us. And that even though we may not see Jesus here in the flesh, he is very much present in our brothers and sisters, in the homeless people that we meet on the streets, in the prisoners, in those who are sick and dying, and in those who do not have enough food to eat. And so rather than pushing each other out of the way or trying to step on top of each other in order to get what we want, Jesus wants us to look out for and to care for the weakest, the poorest, the most vulnerable among us. Because when we look out for the least of these, we serve Christ himself. Now, ultimately, we know that our entrance into heaven will not be because of our good works, but because of the shed blood of Jesus Christ, and through accepting the free gift of salvation which Jesus offers to all. It's up to us whether or not we choose to accept or reject that free gift. But if and when we accept that free gift of salvation that Jesus offers, we enter into a relationship with Jesus. And that relationship is further matured and developed as we serve one another, and as we serve the poor, the marginalized, the strangers, and the least of these. If we truly love Jesus, then we will love those who are in need. If we truly want to follow Jesus, then we will follow him to the hurting, the lost, the poor, and the needy. If we truly want to know Jesus, we will get to know him by serving the least of these and by serving one another. The story goes that in a small Jewish town in Russia, there was a rabbi who disappeared every Friday morning for several hours. His devoted disciples boasted that during those hours, their rabbi went up to heaven and talked to God. A stranger moved into that town who was rather skeptical about all of this, and so he decided to check things out for himself. He hid and watched as the rabbi got up one Friday morning, said his prayers, and then dressed in peasant clothes. The stranger followed as the rabbi grabbed an axe, went off into the woods, and cut some firewood, which he then hauled to a shack on the outskirts of the village, where an old woman and her sick son lived. The rabbi left the firewood with them, enough to last them for a whole week, and then he snuck back home. Having observed the rabbi's actions, the newcomer stayed on in the village and became the rabbi's disciple. And from then on, whenever he heard the villagers say, "On Friday mornings, our rabbi ascends all the way to heaven," the newcomer would quietly add, "if not higher." Jesus' parable in Matthew 25 is not primarily a comprehensive how-to manual about how to get into heaven when we die, but rather it's a description of how his followers will live here and now in the meantime, and how we will find and serve Jesus even when we can't see him. If we want to know Jesus, we will get to know him through serving the least of these. Shane Claiborne is a Christian activist who was one of the founding members of The Simple Way, a Christian community in Philadelphia whose mission is to love God, to love people, to follow Jesus. Shane Claiborne has taken the gospel beyond the streets of Philadelphia to the slums of Calcutta, to the war zones of Iraq. In his book, The Irresistible Revolution, which had an incredible impact on my life when I read it as a young adult, Shane Claiborne describes how he saw God in the homeless people that he served. He said, "I saw one woman in a crowd as she struggled to get a meal from one of the late-night food vans. When we asked her if the meals were really worth the fight, she said, 'Oh, yes. But I don't eat them myself. I get them for another homeless lady, an elderly woman around the corner who can't fight for a meal.' I saw a street kid get $20 panhandling outside of a store and then immediately run to share it with all of his friends. We saw a homeless man lay a pack of cigarettes in the offering plate because it was all he had. I met a blind street musician who was viciously abused by some young guys who would mock her, curse her, and one night even sprayed Lysol in her eyes as a practical joke. As we held her that night, one of us said, 'There are a lot of bad folks in the world, aren't there?' She said, 'Oh, but there are a lot of good ones too. And the bad ones make you, the good ones, seem even sweeter.' We met a 7-year-old girl who was homeless, and we asked her what she wanted to do when she grew up. She paused pensively and then replied, 'I want to own a grocery store.' We asked her why, and she said, 'So I can give out food to all the hungry people.' Mother Teresa used to say, 'In the poor we meet Jesus in his most distressing disguises.' And Shane Claiborne closes by saying, 'Now I knew what she meant.' Friends, if we want to know Jesus, if we truly want to know him, if we want to develop a relationship or deepen our relationship with Christ, we will get to know him in serving others. It's not about keeping track or keeping score about how many good deeds we've done. It's not about making sure that our good deeds outweigh our bad deeds. It's about falling at the feet of Jesus and saying, 'Here am I, Lord, send me. Send me to the poor, to the lost, to the hurting, to the broken. Send me to do your will. Use me as you choose.' When we submit ourselves to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, when we lay our lives on the altar, when we allow him to use us however he chooses, when we follow him to the hurting, the lost, the broken, and the least of these, that's when we truly meet Jesus.